When the series finale of M*A**S*H aired in 1983, it pulled in one of the largest television audiences in American history. It was a night of tears, farewells, and an ending that millions had waited over a decade to see. But tucked inside those emotional final minutes was a small, glaring slip, a detail that had no business appearing in a show set during the Korean War. Before we get to what that mistake actually was, it's worth understanding just how unlikely the whole story of M*A**S*H really was. The origins of M*A**S*H trace back to 1968, when a former Army surgeon named H. Richard Hornberger sat down to turn his own wartime experiences into fiction. Writing under the pen name Richard Hooker, he partnered with author W.C. Hines to produce a novel about 3 military doctors, drawing heavily on Hornberger's service with a real mobile Army surgical hospital unit during the Korean War. The book found an audience by mixing dark battlefield tragedy with irreverent, sharp-edged comedy, a combination that hadn't really been done before. 2 years later, director Robert Altman turned the novel into a film, giving the fictional hospital unit its now famous number by simply having the real unit's designation. By 1972, the story had migrated to network television, where it would go on to run for 11 seasons, far longer than anyone involved originally expected. Part of what gave the show its lived-in authenticity was that several cast members had genuine military backgrounds. Alan Alda, who would become inseparable from the role of Hawkeye Pierce, had spent 6 months with the U.S. Army Reserve in Korea. Jamie Farr, who played the unforgettable Corporal Klinger, had served in the Army in Japan before touring Korea with a USO show. Wayne Rogers, cast as Trapper John, had been a navigator in the Navy, while Mike Farrell, who later joined as B.J. Honeycutt, had served in the Marine Corps. None of it was necessary for fiction to work, but it gave the performances a texture audiences could feel even if they couldn't quite name it. The show's identity nearly looked completely different. McLean Stevenson, who ultimately became the beloved commanding officer Henry Blake, originally read for the part of Hawkeye Pierce before producers steered him toward the CO role instead, a switch that turned out to be one of the best decisions the production made. Comedian Robert Klein was also offered the role of Trapper John McIntyre and turned it down. He later insisted he never regretted the choice, despite the show's eventual success. Behind the camera, things came together just as unpredictably. Screenwriter Larry Gelbart, who had grown disillusioned with Hollywood and relocated to London, was lured back specifically to adapt Altman's film for television. He wrote the pilot script in only 2 days, for a fee of $25,000. Even Corporal Klinger, arguably one of the show's most memorable characters, was never supposed to last. He was written for a single appearance and was originally conceived as a gay character, an idea that was later dropped in favor of the cross-dressing soldier desperately trying to convince the Army he was unfit for duty. The concept was partly inspired by comedian Lenny Bruce's claim that he'd secured a Navy discharge by declaring he had homosexual tendencies. What began as a 1-episode gag turned into one of the show's signature roles. Some of the toughest fights the cast and crew faced weren't creative disagreements among themselves. They were battles with CBS. Gelbart and producer Gene Reynolds pushed hard against the network's insistence on a laugh track, arguing that can laughter clash with a show that was trying to hold comedy and the horror of war in the same frame. CBS wouldn't drop it entirely, but the two sides reached a compromise. No laughter would play during scenes set in the operating room. Over the years, the laugh track was gradually toned down, and the BBC eventually cut it from UK broadcasts altogether. CBS also blocked storylines it worried would cast the American military in an unflattering light. One rejected episode would have shown soldiers deliberately exposing themselves to freezing temperatures so they'd get sick enough to be sent home, a tactic the writers said was based on something Real troops had actually done during the war. The network considered it too unpatriotic to air, much to the writers' frustration. They felt the show was strongest when it leaned into war's messier realities rather than presenting a sanitized version of it. The writers found a more playful way to handle friction with the cast. Tired of actors constantly pushing back on scripts, writer Ken Levine and his colleagues quietly retaliated by writing scenes that required the cast to wear heavy winter parkas while filming on location in blistering 90 to 100-degree heat. The message landed, and the script complaints reportedly slowed down after that. One of the show's more surprising cast departures came down to a legal technicality. Wayne Rogers left after season 3, unhappy with how his character was being used. When producers threatened him with a breach of contract suit, they discovered he'd never actually signed the standard studio agreement. He'd refused it over an outdated morals clause. Without a signature, there was nothing binding him to stay. He said he missed the cast, particularly his friendship with Alan Alda, but never regretted walking away. Few moments in television history landed with the impact of Henry Blake's death. When McLean Stevenson decided to leave the show after season 3, Gelbar and Reynolds chose not to give his character a simple transfer home. Instead, they decided to underline the senselessness of war by having his plane go down on the journey back, with no survivors. To protect the twist, Gelbar handed out scripts missing their final page, so the cast believed they were filming an ordinary send-off. Only after the last scenes were shot, just before the season wrap party, did he give the actors the missing page, revealing that Radar would walk into the operating room and announce Henry's plane had been lost over the Sea of Japan. The cast was stunned into silence. Larry Linville, who played Frank Burns, reportedly called it brilliant on the spot, while Gary Berghoff jokingly assumed the scene would win Stevenson an Emmy. It never did. The sequence was shot in just 2 takes. At home, the reaction was just as strong. More than 1,000 angry letters arrived from viewers, and CBS was reportedly uneasy enough about the backlash that at least one rerun cut the scene entirely. By the later seasons, the writers faced an oddly practical problem. After years of wounded extras passing to the 4077th, they'd nearly exhausted plausible character names. Their fix was to start borrowing them from real life. Season 6 patients were named after the 1977 California Angels infield, and the following season pulled from the 1978 Los Angeles Dodgers roster. Ken Levine even snuck in a personal touch, naming Radar's love interest in Goodbye, Radar, after one of his own former girlfriends. Perhaps the most striking fact about the series is simply how long it ran compared to the war it depicted. The actual Korean War lasted just over 3 years. M*A*S*H.